someday I'll get high tech and I'll be able to put the drawing and me into the video. And get a green screen, go like Twitch style. Anyway, so what I'm going to do to start is kind of sight the height of those potatoes. I'm going to kind of use my pencil like we talked about, hold it out in front of me, measuring up to the monitor here. I'm looking at the distance between the top of the potatoes and the bottom of the image. And I'm comparing that to the space above the potatoes. Alright, so my potatoes are kind of a little more than halfway up. I don't know if I can get in frame. No. Well, that's right. So I've got kind of, say about 2/3 of the space up above as I do down below. So that looks about right. This is kind of where the top of my potatoes are. I'm going to mark lightly to start. Let me actually move this over so I can see it too. Let's move it here. There we go. Now I can see if you can see my marks. Okay, so it's really light. See, I'm kind of, like we talked about, using the side of my pencil here. So I want to start with kind of big shapes first. So let's try to figure out how far over, so we kind of got the potatoes there, how far over the potato tray goes. Okay? So I'm measuring that distance versus the distance to the side from the other side. So this distance here I'm measuring against this distance here. And this one's a little bit longer, so I'm going to say they go to about here. Okay. All right, so we've got kind of a big shape here. Drops down. I think that might be a little far. That looks pretty good. So here's kind of the top edge here. Here's the bottom. And we've got this cloth shape here. I should cite those angles. So I'm looking at those angles and they look like they're going down. These are the kind of diagonal folds in the cloth. Something like that. This drops down lower. We want to work from big shapes to small shapes. And see, that's way too far down. So I'm going to measure my distance up to the cloth here against my distance of the cloth. So it looks like it's about thirds. So I'm going to say my cloth goes down to about here. So that's kind of what I want to shoot for. Yeah, that looks a little better. I'm going to bring this over this way. This up to here. So this is almost kind of like sculpting more than, well, not more than drawing, more than the way we maybe usually draw. So now I'm going to add this first big potato. I want to work large shapes to small shapes. One of the cool things about using a picture, we can zoom in on it. So if you need to zoom in on an area, you can click on your window and a little plus or minus at the bottom. So you can zoom in on details if you need to, which is a useful tool that I wish I had in real life. Alright, so here's kind of my potato plan here. Let's figure out this structure down here. Got kind of a central post, it looks like. And then it kind of divides right here. Up. Yeah, up there. Here. Cool. Scoot that up a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to sight the angle of the crossbar here. So it looks like it's going at about this angle. And I'm going to say the other sort of post shape is about here. Now I'm going to add this other kind of platform on the scale. So we want to really pay attention and focus on kind of completing each step as we go. Because if I move on without having a solid drawing in the loose block end, then when I block things in further, it's just going to be building detail on top of things that are wrong. And sometimes we can fudge through that, but a lot of times it's just going to wreck things, especially once we get to portraits. Everything has to be pretty spot on for it to work right and for us to get a good likeness. Alright, so I'm bringing up the central base here. You might zoom in, it's a little hard to see. I'm going to look at the height of this, it's about here. And we have this thing that kind of looks like a hacksaw blade. These notches where you stick that weight, I suppose, to weigh everything. Right here, this is a good example to look at the negative space. So that'd be like the background space between the scale and that gap. So sometimes we can look at the negative space and it gives us better information for drawing or other information for drawing that we can use to kind of help figure out the positive shapes as well. I've got this book over here. Something like that. Okay. So, sight the tilt on this a little. It's a little shallower, maybe. Drawing this horizon line. Alright, so now we want to take like a little bit of time to kind of look over what we've done so far and try to like check everything. So you want to look at the shapes you've got, just kind of measure how proportional they are. We want to look at the negative shapes and think about whether they're shaped correctly. We just want to kind of get this very simple lay-in as correct as possible before we move forward. So I'm going to give you a couple minutes to kind of look around and fix things before I move on. I'll look around and fix things too. I think maybe it's like too far over. This needs to move up a little bit. Now I'm curious about what's on top of the book, so I'm going to zoom in on that and take a look. Looks like tiny spoons. Alright, something like that. Alright, so the next thing we want to do is to define the shadow areas. So we need to break the whole picture up into shadow and not shadow areas. So what we're looking for is whatever's like definitely a shadow, right? So for instance, on this potato, we've got a shadow shape that kind of comes around like this, and back around this way, and then kind of splits up the potato like this. Okay? So we've got, if we think about everything in like 5 different tones, we've got 2 tones in this light area here. We've got that highlight shape, and we've got the kind of light middle tone, but then everything on the right hand side is shadow. So I want to take that shadow and block it in. And I think like most of the background is pretty shadowy, but we don't need to worry about that. We can watercolor all that. So just worry about kind of your subjects. This should reduce everything to kind of a very flat graphic sort of image. We do want to maintain our contour lines so that we can see what's going on still. So update those as necessary. So now I'll look at my next potato here. I'm going to fix him a little bit. And our shadow, we mostly have shadow on this guy. So it kind of goes like this, and then up to here. Here's the potato. Here's the shadow. Now, I know right now you're thinking there's like really dark shadows right here. I can get some of those, but don't worry about those yet. Okay, it looks like there's kind of 2 overlapping potatoes here. So one kind of comes like this. Yeah, so like this, and then down into this shadow. And it's got a shadow that goes like this. got one in the back. One in the back looks like it's getting more light. So its shadow shape kind of just gets right here. Alright. We've got some cast shadows on the back. There's a little doohickey that comes up like this. And then there's another one that comes up like this. Should probably use some kind of guard. I need a cleaner sheet of paper. So if you find that you smudge your drawing when you're shading things, going back over, you just fold a sheet of paper like this and use it as kind of a paper guard. Now I'm going to try to get like this edge here, where the kind of edge of the weighing tray is. I'm going to kind of make that a little clearer and define it now. So I want to look closely and try to get the best semblance of that curve I can. Alright. Now right now I'm using a pretty dull pencil, which works pretty well for this step. I'm going to save my sharper pencil for when I move on to the next part. So there's a little bit of light up top here, then we're going to have shadow in here. Again, as I'm drawing, I'm just kind of rubbing a little bit of charcoal on there off the side of my pencil. I don't really want to get in there with the tip. If I do use the tip, I want to be really gentle. You want to think about rubbing charcoal onto the drawing, not scratching charcoal into the drawing. Or not charcoal, graphite. Alright, so let's look at this piece of fabric here. I'm going to try to define this edge a little more clearly. Actually, seems like it comes up a little more than down. Maybe the root of many of my problems here. And then we've got kind of a shadow shape that comes around like this, goes up. So the nice thing about doing a still life is it just needs to look like what it is, right? And what I mean by that is it just needs to look like, this potato just needs to look like a potato. It doesn't need to look like this specific potato necessarily. Nobody's going to recognize this potato. By contrast, when we get into portraits, it's not enough to draw something that looks like a human being. We have to draw a specific human being. So kind of ramping up the level of detail and specificity required. But other than that, it's the same process, and that's a really important thing to understand, is that we should be drawing the same way when we're drawing people, when we're drawing geometric shapes like we were before, when we're drawing still lifes. It should all be the same, done the same way. I think that highlight up on top I overemphasized a little bit. It's too much. Yeah, it's more like that. And as I'm kind of moving these around, I can think about doing like contour lines. So what I mean by that is kind of strokes that follow the curve of the fabric, and that'll give it a little more kind of definition and form. And it's just a little bit, but every little detail that we add in helps a little bit. Alright, so and then we've got a shadow shape coming down here. Let's clean this up in here a little bit. I'm still looking a little too ambiguous, so I'm going to define these edges a little better. This cloth is really one spot where we're going to have to make some decisions about the level of detail we want to get into in this piece, because there's a lot of kind of like lacy stuff going on at the bottom. There's a lot of details that we could definitely try to put in there, but it's also going to get kind of tricky. So we want to kind of figure out what level of detail is appropriate. Um, Something to remember is the more specific you are in your drawing, the more important it is that it be right. So, all right, so I think the angle of this shadow shape is kind of like here. I've committed some kind of minor crime here, I can tell, but I can't quite see what it is. So, it might be fudging time. You guys can probably see what I did. That'll work. Good enough. So yeah, there's our kind of major shadow shapes. We got one up here, we got one fold right over here, and then we got, well, two folds right here and here, and we got kind of this triangular shape, right? So let's move down here. We got that. Let's look underneath here. We got kind of a shadow shape all the way underneath here, except for that rim, and it kind of gets skinnier as it moves over to this side, so it's kind of shaped like this, I reckon. Shade that in. And then these are real dark, but we're just going to shade them a little bit for now. You could probably go real dark on these shapes if you wanted to. I don't think it would cause any problems, but let's try to stick to specific procedures to reinforce them in our brains, make them routine. So yeah, when I have a simple background like this, I'm not going to worry about sketching it out. I'm just going to watercolor it. If there was important stuff going on in the background, that might be a little bit different, but there's not really. All right, so I'm going to leave this whole kind of yellow hacksaw blade piece. I'm going to leave that untoned. I'm going to shade here. I'm going to leave the top of this untoned as well, because I think it's mostly going to be color later on. So I don't need to shade it, at least not yet. All right. Gotcha. So we can see on the bottom of these that we've got highlights, right? So what we want to have is like two tone areas. We want to have the highlight shape. You don't really need to worry about drawing the highlight shape out right now, but I'll show you. You did that highlight shape. And then we want to have a little bit of a middle light halo around it. And then the rest will be shadow. And there's some small highlights up on top, like here on this ridge. But I'm not going to worry about those. I don't think I need that level of detail. When we think about what level of detail we're going to put into a drawing or a painting, the things to consider are our materials and how much time we want to put in. So the watercolor is not necessarily super accurate without putting in a ton of time, so I don't necessarily want to worry too much. I need a little halo around there. And you can add like a little slightly darker contour line to kind of show the border of that halo. So here on this one here, we've got kind of a middle tone or high middle here, highlight here and here. And I do want to draw At least eventually. You can wait till the next step if you want. But I do want to draw borders around those highlights for the watercolor, just to make sure I maintain those. Okay, now shade the rest of this. And probably all this up here. So most of this post is going to be dark, except I've got a little highlight up here you can maybe see. Let's see, this is kind of a slightly foreshortened circle, but almost circular. So I've got a little shape up here where the light's hitting. I've got a little shape right here. I'll erase those out. Maintain those. But everything else under there looks pretty dark. So you'll see right in this area here, like between the post here and the background, at least on my monitor, you kind of lose the edge of the background or the edge of the post. That's okay. That's an opportunity for what's called a lost and found edge, which is where the background and the subject blur together in some places, and that can be a really cool effect to have. So it's not necessarily a problem. So the last thing to shade is the side of this platform. Oh, and then the book. I don't even know what to do about this book. There's too much going on here for my brain. So a lot of times we'll get into this situation like we have with the spoons here. And a good example is teeth, where there's like a lot of something going on. It's hard to figure out exactly how to capture it. So I think I'm gonna go ahead and try to get in there like an idiot and get the details of this, because I can't figure out a better solution. So teeth, for example, sometimes it's better to draw them just as like a chunk, like a single block of tooth, rather than trying to draw each and every individual tooth, so that makes it look wonky. You have to have a really subtle touch to draw all the teeth. Anyway, maybe I just edit those out. I'm just having a hard time seeing all the highlights and shadows here, like a spoon shorthand. So I've zoomed in on these a little bit to try to help me get a little more detail about what's going on. Okay. I think that's all I'm going to worry about. That's good enough. All right, so our next step is going to be to add deep shadows and medium tone around the highlights. So I'm going to get rid of this guy. I'm actually going to switch to a drawing pencil. You don't necessarily need to have a drawing pencil, but if you do, this is what it's useful for. So I want to kind of work back through, same way I just did, and I want to get like my deep shadows. So anywhere that is like super dark or almost super dark, I want to get. And this kind of makes new shapes. So I'm just going to kind of work through the same way I did before, starting with my potatoes here, and then moving around to the other side. So now we want to imagine the shadow areas that we defined earlier as having kind of two tones. And so whatever's on the darker side of that spectrum, we want to shade in. Anything that's on the lighter side, we can leave kind of medium. We can also, if we need to kind of pop out the medium tones that we're adding, we can darken the shadow tones that we put earlier, but we want to have two distinct tones in the shadow areas. So we talk about value scales, and it should be reasonably easy to get like 8 separate values out of your graphite. And if you put in a little effort, it should definitely be possible for all of you to get 10 separate tones out. But the minimum you need is usually 5. So kind of a paper white, a medium light, a medium dark, and a dark. Okay, there we go. That's pretty good. What's going on with this potato? I feel like I did it bad earlier, but that's impossible. Alright, so there's a lot of details on these potatoes. There's a lot of different eyes. I'm not going to worry about those yet. I'm going to kind of save details for later. I'm kind of grown unhappy with this highlight here. Hoping that shifting that doesn't make me shift everything else, but we'll see. Like here. So this area here is filled with lies right now. But that's okay. We do what we gotta do. Optimally, ideally, eventually the goal would be for there to be no lies or very few lies or some little white lies, but this one is filled with blatant falsehoods right here. That's okay. So we kind of have to make calls about whether to redo everything or just go with what we've got. And in this case, I'm going to go with what I've got because I have to finish this while class is going. So it's situationally dependent. If you're doing like a commission for somebody, it's clearly going to be a problem. By all means, fix it. If we're just doing a still life and it looks plausible, we can keep going. Do a little better next time, right? It's all that counts. All right, so everything, or most of the stuff down here is really pretty dark. Boy, this chair is messing up my back today. So I'm trying to decide if I want to keep those white sort of highlights down here, or what shapes I can incorporate from there that will give me the most bang for my buck. I'll keep one here, I think. And then this guy here. The rest of that I can probably just darken. And since we're watercoloring this afterwards, we don't have to go super dark with our values because the watercolor will kind of naturally make everything a little bit darker. So just as long as you have like 2 distinct values in your shadow area, you should be good. Again, I'm kind of thinking about contour lines, defining the curvature of my subject as I kind of stroke my pencil across the paper. And the nice thing about not having super strong contour lines in a lot of places is that as I'm drawing, I don't take them as being rules or established law, I take them as being suggestions. So if I see a better line, I can take it and add that instead. Here's another lie right here. That white has a much longer bob on it. Don't tell anybody. I squished this somehow. I'm not sure exactly what I did, but I squished it somehow. Okay. Got a little highlight down here. See that? All right. The nice thing about faces, as opposed to strange contraptions like this scale, is that we have some familiarity with the structure up in our brains. Whereas this thing, unless you've used it a lot, you probably don't really have a full understanding of its form. So there's like 2 kind of historical methods of drawing. One is kind of Renaissance based, and the idea is to study the form of what you're drawing so that you've got an understanding of it in your brain. And you look too, but that supplements your looking at what you're looking at. And the other kind of school of thought is the Impressionist school, which is you're always just drawing what you're seeing, So it shouldn't matter what the thing is or if you understand it at all. So you should draw like an alien that's just coming down and landing its ship, the same way you draw a human being, regardless of your familiarity with either. Try to give you a little bit of both as far as instruction goes. I'm going to make this a middle tone to sort of separate out those highlights. I'll move up here. So you can go slower than me if you want, because you're going to have your async time to work. I'm going to try to get through our 4 steps, or at least get started on the 4th step before we go async. So if I'm going too fast, don't worry about it. You can catch up. Just try to make sure you understand the process here. All right. That's the other thing that's kind of nice about drawing in person. So you can't zoom in on it, so it kind of forces you to work in an appropriate level of detail. If you can't see it, then you have to figure out how to do it with less detail, which is kind of nice in certain ways. It's a double-edged sword. All right, so that's kind of our 3rd step of dividing the tones a little bit further. Oh, I can also come in here now and do kind of highlights. I've got highlights. If I want to, I can lightly shade the non-highlight areas, or I can just use the watercolor for that part, because they're going to be like pretty close to our local color there. The other thing to add is details. So I've got my potato eyes, for example. For my details, I'm usually going to roll up onto the tip of my pencil, and that way I can get like small lines for details. If I want to go dark, I'll press in, but most of the time I'll keep it pretty light and just kind of, again, rub graphite onto the paper as opposed to scratching it in. I don't want to scratch it in. That's another thing about mechanical pencils that is kind of a problem, is they have really small surface area, so they tend to scratch it in more than rub it on. Alright. I can also kind of build up pigment over time, right? Like I can apply light pressure, just stay in this area for a while, and it'll get dark. So I don't have to like press hard to get it dark. I can kind of build it up slowly. Sometimes that makes more sense because it's easier to put on than it is to take off. Oh yeah, here's some details. Okay, so this looks like it's kind of doesn't really have a contour line around it. Some kind of two dark shapes. I guess those are the two sides of the screw, and there's a light part in the middle. This whole piece probably isn't like white tone. It's not highlight, so I can add a little bit of tone to that. I could add the teeth into the top of this if I wanted to, but I don't think I want to go to that level of detail. Add some cast shadow if I want. I think I'm going to leave the cast shadow from these items out just because it's going to cause confusion. And it's a pretty simple shape, so I can just add that with the watercolor. So yeah, now you're looking for details and kind of hunting mistakes you may have made. Oh, and I've got it set up so my camera and my image are right next to each other on the screen, and I can compare that. Oh boy. That'll make you feel bad about yourself. I think we've got a little bit of shadow here. And it fades into like a light middle tone right there. Maybe this is a little bit shallower. So this is also the time when I would really get in there and kind of examine the nuance of these shadow shapes here, because there's a lot going on. So one of the ideas that we work with for portrait or still life painting is you kind of work everything the way we did first, and then you start focusing on details. So at this point, I can start thinking about how I want people to look at this image, and I can start making choices about how I want to set it up. So if I want an area to be a focal point, one of the things I can do that works really well is to put a lot of detail there. So if I want people to look at the potatoes here, I do a lot of detail on the potatoes. If I want people to look at the fabric, I do a lot of detail on the fabric. Same thing with the machinery down here. I also might think about how to move my viewer from one focal point to another. So if I'm going to put detail here, but then I want to get them over here, I maybe have like a couple of edges that I kind of emphasize. Or maybe just some spots of detail that I kind of emphasize, and they kind of lead to each other and get them from one focal point to another. Ideally, I have at least 2 focal points, maybe 3. This kind of empty, or else it would work well as one. Maybe I could figure out how to make it one. But I kind of want to have a journey. So one of the things we talk about in Art 1 is like your art composition should be like a Japanese garden. You should have these points of interest that you want people to look at, and you should have paths that lead them from one point of interest to another and kind of walk them through it. People are kind of lazy and like to be told how to look at a piece of art. All right, does anybody have any questions? All right. So I would like you to spend asynchronous time today getting this drawing as good as you can get it, as tight as you can get it. If you need to, if it's really bad, maybe do another one. But try to have the best drawing possible for Thursday's session. And dang it, stop that. we'll meet on Thursday and start watercoloring them. Okay? Does that work for everybody? Okay, cool. I'm going to take a little break, but then I will come back and maybe work on this a little bit more, or I'll answer questions if you have them, okay? So I'll be back in a few minutes.